Hi, this is David with EV World, where we talk about green energy, the stock markets, and electric vehicles. And I'm a little tongue-tied today for some reason. How are you doing, Mike?
Great to be here, David.
It's always nice to have you in so we can get a little bit more of a technical perspective on some of the things we get to talk about. So, our first story today is on electrified transport investment soared globally in 23, passing up renewable energy investment. Now, this isn't terribly surprising considering I deal a lot in the green energy space and talking to people that see investment. The costs of like investing in solar and wind have gotten with current interest rates aren't financially viable. And so maybe this doesn't surprise me as much, but what was more surprising is where this money was spent in the world. So China spent more than any other nation on the energy transition. So one of the things you hear about all the time is who are the big polluters in the world? You know, the United States has like less than 5% of the world's carbon emissions, and the big ones are China and India. Well, they each have what, 5 times the population of the United States?
hmm
You know, and they manufacture, their argument is they manufacture the goods that the United States buys because the United States, I think, what is it? We consume like 25% of the world's economic output. It's some big number.
I
I
don't know
mean,
the number, but
yeah,
that
but
would
it's
not
like
surprise me. No. Yeah.
we're 5% of the world's population. We consume 25% of the world's output, and I think our GDP reflects, something along that number. And that's how they say they like we're 25% of the world's GDP, and because of that, they assume that we're consuming that much. Now, let's see what we've got here. So, according to Bloomberg, they're trying to get the shift is trying to get to net zero. Now that's a challenge. Electrified transportation sped past renewable energy last year to become the world's largest category of energy transition investment. The transportation sector is a leading source of global carbon dioxide emissions, and because of the long lives of vehicles, investment decisions today will take a while to translate into emissions reductions. Considering this, the rise in spending is necessary and will accelerate a lot more. What I thought fascinating was global investment in energy transition was $1.77 trillion in
Wow.
2023. I mean, that is massive. You think about how big that is. And I'll put some of this in perspective. That was an increase of 17% from the year before. Electrified transportation spending was $634 billion, an increase of 36%. That's a pretty big increase, 36% year over year.
Yeah. Yeah.
So
Absolutely.
we're seeing a lot of growth there. Now,
I
that
think
total,
that's interesting from a couple of different things. One, I, you hear maybe more anecdotally about we're not doing enough, we're not seeing enough, and then you see numbers like that where this is non-trivial. Those are huge numbers. Those are huge percentages of people moving forward and investing in this space and what it looks like. So kind of this idea that we're stagnant or people aren't involved or whatever that looks like. Hey, we're not doing enough to move forward. I think this shows that that's very counter, to that where these actions are taking place. These things are happening. People are investing in this space and moving forward with it. I think the other piece to that from the transportation side, you mentioned, kind of the traditional renewable generation space and wind and solar and how things are being invested in there. Maybe on the transportation side, it's probably a little easier to pencil those things out and see what they look like. It is a long-term investment, and it's maybe a little bit more fixed outcome or fixed variables in that space to kind of, if you're somebody who owns a fleet, if you're somebody who has a fixed route every day, whatever that looks like, you can kind of figure this out and say, hey, I have a real and tangible cost improvement for my business bottom line if I move to this space where fuel is a that cheaper, where maintenance is cheaper, where you're starting to see these fleet transitions and going along in that space too. So it's very positive thing to see. They're both interconnected. They're both playing off one another. But that's a really good improvement to see in that space because it has such a big impact in kind of the overall greenhouse gas emission space across the world.
No, it's crazy to think that people would think this is a small amount, but I look for a lot of bias in a lot of articles. Because this is from InsideClimateNews.org, and you never know, where some of this information comes from. I look for bias in articles as to what's really happening and what's not. But you look at things like this. It's saying 634 billion includes light cars and trucks, buses, commercial vehicles, two-wheelers, among others. And some of it was used for building factories and charging infrastructure. When you think about that in terms of building factories, well, that's a sort of one-time expense, to a degree. It's one time maybe that covers the next 30 years, kind of,
Mhm.
but there's a lot of expense when you look at companies like Tesla and Lucid, Rivian here in the United States, and they spend a lot of money on building infrastructure for creating vehicles, and the same with all the new battery plants that are being built in the United States to produce batteries for EVs. There's a lot of expense going on in that field, and it's taking some time to bring it to market.
Yeah, yeah. I go back to it's an old, physics concept or engineering, whatever you want to call it. Things can't change in zero time. It takes
Right.
time for anything to change, and there's a ramp up period. There's kind of this, the physics idea is like a moment of inertia. It's harder to get things in motion. It's harder to get that first push on everything, and it just takes time. So it's one of those, seeing this out there in that space where I think it's good ammunition that like things are moving, things are changing. It's going to take time. It's going to take a little extra oomph to really ramp up on that curve and get these things changing in a much faster pace.
Well, they even mention here that Ford says Ford will cut a shift. It's 1,400 employees that they're moving from making the F-150 Lightning to move over to making gas-powered Broncos. Which,
Mm.
from an economic sense for Ford, that probably makes sense. Ford has struggled with bringing their vehicles to market. You and I were talking about this before the episode. I mean, when you think of Ford now, you think of only two vehicles, the F-150 and the Mustang. And we were looking at their website before we started doing the show, and what we see, they have the Bronco, the Mustang, and they have a couple of other SUVs, and otherwise it's trucks, and the only car they make anymore is the Mach E, and or well, they have the Mustang still, but the Mach E is essentially a crossover.
Hmm.
It's really not just a true coupe or sedan anymore. But here's what's kind of interesting. So these are the leaders in energy transition investment. And this is, eh,
Hmm.
you look at these numbers for what China has spent. This is for last year, $675.9 billion dollars, double what the US spent, double pretty much what 27 countries in the EU spent. And then you look at the whole rest of the world. Now, Germany's part of the EU. Um, United Kingdom, they're not part of the EU anymore, are they? They did that whole Brexit thing, so they would
Yep.
be separate. But you've got France, Brazil, you've got some countries spending considerable amounts on some of these things. If we look at China, the dark blue is renewable energy, and that number alone is close to that 300 million or 300 billion mark. And then you've got another big space here that this is an electrified transport. That's probably a quarter or $250 billion. It's a lot. They're by far and away the leader in the space.
It
The
is.
United States.
I think it would be kind of interesting to tease out a stat of how much of that is new infrastructure investment versus retrofitting or replacing.
Mhm.
As as nations like China and India are modernizing, and building all
Right.
this infrastructure out to start with, is that just a product of them building? They're expanding, they're growing, they're electrifying, they're bringing communication, they're connecting their rural spaces and everything, and they're doing it in this new space with electrification, in the transportation sector and renewables and everything. So I'm almost in the back of my head wondering like, well, is that a little bit different in that space because they're growing. they are still building, they are still developing, they're still putting this all in place, and they just happen to be spending it in this bucket, instead of the fossil fuel bucket that they would have been spending it in 2 decades ago if they were at this point in time. So it's awesome to see. That's what we want to see talking about EVs in this space. But it's how much of that is just, hey, this is the wave of the future, and we're filling in anyway, and we just kind of happen to be doing it in this space as opposed to a different way we would have been doing it a couple decades ago.
What's interesting here, look at India, 31 billion. That's 5%, less than 5% of what China spent.
Yeah.
That's really a big difference. I know India is trying to make some transitions. I mean, India is a huge consumer of electric bikes, and but we'll see where that goes. Let me see what we've got here. Oh, the US was up 22% from the prior year. Oh, China actually was a decrease of 11% from the prior
Hmm.
year. That's kind of interesting.
Yeah.
Now, one third of China was one third of global investment. The combined totals of the US, European Union, United Kingdom was greater than China's, which was different than in 2022. China slowed down just a little bit, it looks like. Let me see. Investment in energy transition continues a steady rise. Global energy transition investment by sector. The dark blue is renewable energy. And this is each year. I mean, you're seeing still, $600 billion worldwide. It's gone up a little bit from the year before. It's seen a steady increase other than from 11, till 14
Hmm.
and then but it's growing steadily. But even down here in 2013, we were still at 200 billion. Now we're at 600 billion. That's tripled. That's,
Yeah.
a pretty big process for 10 years.
Yeah. Yeah.
Let's see. Anyways, I just found that. Oh, let me see. Global offshore wind spending, $76 billion, up 79%. Now, that's kind of surprising considering, and they're talking here about a whole lot of canceled projects and other obstacles in the US and Europe. But I know people who finance these projects, and they said they just the interest rates just don't add up to make it worthwhile. Hydrogen investment was 10 billion, triple the prior year. Carbon capture nearly doubled. The There was 5.7 billion spent in European Union on carbon capture and 2.8 in the US and only 926 million in China. I look at a lot of stuff currently in the field of like electrifying big trucks. And
Hmm.
I was I actually asked about this on a journal journalist call a couple days ago with Ford. Um, they Ford just took on Eco Labs, which makes specialized cleaning products, and they are electrifying 1,000 vehicles in their fleet in California. And I asked a
Hmm.
question, what does that carbon capture credit look like for that? And they claimed they were doing it just they hadn't considered that. And I'm just like, whatever. I almost put in there,
Okay.
if you don't want the carbon credits, can I have them? Because I figured
Yeah.
because they're doing 1,000 Mach-E's and F-150 Lightnings. And I was like, the carbon credit's got to be at least $200 per month per vehicle. Okay,
Yeah.
because they're
No, that's
replacing
that's
gas cars or diesel cars with
non-trivial.
this.
That's great. Yeah.
Yeah, we're talking $200,000 a month. Now I realize a company that's buying 1,000 vehicles probably has a big bottom line, okay, and all that, but still, that's not a small amount of money. And they were talking about how they're going to roll it
Well,
out
and
across the country.
that's
It's like,
not a new concept. That's been around the block for a long, long time, and the value of those credits are well understood. So that the idea you wouldn't factor that into your equation when kind of penciling that stuff out. It's a
well,
little,
I think
oh
it's
no,
kind
we
of
didn't think
new.
about that. No, okay. Somebody in your
I do.
accounting department thought about that.
You'd think so when they were making this. Well, the fact that they did it in California first, where the credits for commercial investment in EVs is much bigger than anywhere else. It's like, oh yeah, just coincidentally did it in California. It
Mhm.
wasn't because there's more charging stations there, I can tell you, because they're not really going to be using the charging stations because they'll just charge them at their own offices. So
Mhm.
I just thought that was kind of interesting. I'm like, oh, we're doing it just for the good of society, and it's like, well, yeah, there's more to this. Now, this next article is something kind of interesting. The stigma of dirty fossil fuels is driving young people away from oil and gas. Now, this was by iHeartRadio, and the left's relentless attack on fossil fuels has left a lasting impression on the industry. It's driving young people away because of the narrative that oil and gas are dirty. Now, this may take a different perspective. Young people just don't want to go into it, and their labor force is aging, and they're always looking for ways to address that. The oil and gas companies, even though they're hitting record high production, they struggle to get enough workers. And it's funny too because oil and gas work generally pays really well.
Pays very well,
It's
very well.
very
Up and down
hard
from
work
the
though.
yeah, the frontline workers to the studies and engineers to well, obviously executives and what that looks like. But up and down the board, those are hard jobs and difficult
Yeah.
jobs. Yeah, they pay very well.
I think entry level labor on a even in a domestic oil field is above $30 an hour. I
Hmm.
mean, with no skills whatsoever. I mean, it's very hard, demanding work, but it pays really well. Petroleum engineering is the highest paying bachelor's degree in the United States with an average
Yep.
annual salary of 97.5. And I'm assuming that's what says average annual. So is that when somebody just enters, that's not entry level, or is that entry level? I don't know, but that's
I don't know
still
if that'd be entry
pretty high.
level. That seems a little high for entry level, but I bet it's not that far away.
Yeah. And let's see. Um, some Exxon plants. They really don't get into a lot of meat in the details. The climate activists and the media goes along with this narrative that we can easily replace fossil fuels and that wind and solar are cheaper. People's understanding of energy is severely lacking, and being informed that people really just hate fossil fuels. Look, I don't hate fossil fuels. I do hate pollution. Okay. And so I do like electric vehicles. I think there's benefits of going green? Absolutely. And it's really I think you have to take some good with the bad in a lot of this. I sometimes think that our energy transition in vehicles, while we mostly talk about full battery electric vehicles, I think for a lot of people, just a plain hybrid is good for probably apartment dwellers and a plug-in hybrid. Do I think people need to get away from all 100% gas vehicles? Probably. I think that that's the proper route, and I'm excited for and I've mentioned this a number of times. I'm excited about the 2025 Dodge Ram pickup truck, with the 650 horsepower, with a
Mhm.
150-mile battery plus a gas generator, not a gas engine, a gas generator, but it's that electric engine's cranking out 650 horsepower. You can tow pretty much anything with 650 horsepower. Okay, and it has a range of 690 miles not towing, or when it's
Yeah.
between the gas generator and the electric battery. And even towing, even if you severely limited how far it could go, you could still go 200 miles in that thing.
Yeah.
Okay, and even towing a heavy load. And that's kind of game changing for the construction industry. We see all kinds of things, and I see all kinds of arguments, but it's like you can't deny that that's not better for your children, everything, in terms of everything like air quality, cheaper cost to operate your vehicle, less maintenance on your vehicle. How are any of those things bad? I
Yep.
get so sick of the political arguments that, gas good, EV bad, you know, from one side, and the other side's like everybody who drives, a gas powered car must hate the planet, you know,
Yeah.
and I don't agree with either of those statements, right? And
No, I
there's got to
agree.
be
And
something
when
happy
it
in the
comes down
middle.
to users and people who are in this space, and there are always there's hurdles and there's real limitations that people are still trying to solve for. And in a space like that, if you're using that vehicle for work and power, like I need raw power. I need something
Mhm.
like that previous versions and iterations of electric vehicles couldn't produce. It's the same with renewable energy connecting to the grid, you need a big old generator to power a big old motor. So when you talk about manufacturing and arc welding and all of these processes, car crushers, things like that, that are just this, I need a lot of oomph. And historically, it's a big old coal plant or a nuclear plant or a natural gas plant can provide that oomph. So it's real things, real considerations, real worries out there from people who actually operate in these spaces to say, hey, I'd love to do it if it could do this. But day to day, like I need a big old truck to haul a big old load. And what's out there today can't do that. So yeah, it's interesting to see, like you were listening, like check, it can do the job. Check, it's better to cheaper to operate and maintain. Check, it reduces your climate things, but it's that first checkbox. Can it do the job? Well, no.
Yes,
But now if it can do the job, all these other things, it compounds on itself. It's like that's a great thing all around to
right.
see.
No, I'm just saying, because a lot of my close friends are in the, in the trades,
Hmm.
and their argument is, well, I can't tow anything, and those people actually tow.
Yep.
Okay, there's not many other people I know that are towing very often. Okay, if you're not in some kind of trade that you're towing behind your truck, and that's an answer for all those people. And I commend, Ram for bringing that to market. I mean, I think that's, they're going to see a reduction in operating costs and, lots of other benefits. Um, let's see. And I wanted to ask you your own opinion of this because you're involved in grid consulting here locally. During the
Mhm.
flood a few years ago, we shut down the nuclear power plant here in Nebraska. What do you make of that?
Mhm.
I mean, I always think that was a waste, and I think part of it is maybe nuclear wasn't as cheap as some of the other ways we're able to produce energy here in Nebraska. I mean, I'm not really sure what the ongoing thought is because they closed it because of the flood and then just never reopened it.
Yeah, and that's a true statement. There's such a Yeah, there was the flood that initially caused the closure, which it shut it down. It wasn't safe to operate. And what happened in Fukushima and other places like that was the right decision to make. It's you want to operate this thing safely. Failure of any of your safety protocols is really, really unacceptable for a nuclear plant. So that was the right decision, but it's market pressures are what really ended up killing that thing. There was some upkeep, there was some things that had to be done, some maintenance, all of that. And these are all talking points from the newspaper articles that came out at the time. But ultimately, it was too expensive to operate, and they looked at all of those. And nuclear has such a high overhead cost of you have to have a backup to the backup to the backup of each little widget in the plant, and each one of those little widgets has to be certified to operate in an environment with radiation. Once it's done being in service, it's irradiated. So you have to do something with it. You have to do all of these other additional steps that you don't have from these other power sources that just start accumulating and accumulating and accumulating. One of the things the plant locally didn't have going for it, I think at the time it was the smallest nuclear plant in the United States. So normally where you'll get some
Mhm.
of that volume discount. Hey, we have these same overhead requirements. I need this person to operate this or manage this. Hey, if the plant's two or three times as big, that overhead cost gets spread out amongst all of those other megawatts being generated. Whereas what we had locally here, it was small, so you didn't get that kind of bulk discount with that as you had with everything else. So at the end of the day, the market price through renewables, through wind, a lot of that through subsidization, where you could operate at these very low prices and bid into the market at a low price. It just wasn't cost competitive anymore. Now you wonder if the utility is looking back on that decision and saying, boy, with polar vortexes and issues with natural gas, and now this issue with coal plants being shut down or being required to shut down or update on emissions and what that looks like. It's kind of, well, wouldn't it be great to have this good old workhorse in our back pocket all the time? And I don't know, I'm sure they pencil it out and what that would look like in that space of no, day to day, it's still so expensive to operate for those couple of emergencies where we really needed that power. Maybe the financially it still doesn't make sense in what it is, but ultimately it was an economic decision where it was too expensive to run, and you could get power cheaper off the grid at the time when those
That,
decisions were made.
This is just fascinating to think that the renewable energy has been cheaper than nuclear, right? But that being said, you know what's interesting is
Mhm.
out of the 50 US states, I think we rank 50th in the cost of electricity. We're the cheapest state in the country
Yep.
for consumer electricity. Now, if you were going to go operate a Bitcoin mining operation, we're not even close. And what's kind of funny is Louisiana's fairly cheap in that regard, and Washington State are is fairly cheap in
Yeah.
that regard.
I
And
know Louisiana's surprising. I know Washington because of all the hydropower. They have very, very cheap rates in the Pacific Northwest.
yeah, what was interesting in North America, the cheapest spot is Quebec because of their hydroelectric. They were like three and a
Mhm.
half cents a kilowatt hour for electric, and that was way cheaper than most of the rest. So you see some things with gas flare-offs in Texas.
Yeah.
You can get power for like 3 cents a kilowatt hour, but that's once again it's only really useful for Bitcoin mining because you can't use it as consistent power feeding into the grid. So we had a question. What what do you think about hydrogen powered vehicles? Are we going to see any big car brand making hydrogen power vehicles? I mean, what do we have? We have Nikola in the commercial space, but Nikola is not done too well financially. I'm hoping that they will survive, but they're making some hydrogen fuel cell vehicles in terms of
Mhm.
big trucks. And then, of course, Toyota's done some stuff. But, people who've test driven the hydrogen vehicles, they're just not impressed with them. They're not as impressive to drive as a gas car. And there's certainly nowhere near in the, your EV is kind of like driving a spaceship. They typically are far beyond what's the tech in gas cars, and so it's just not the same experience. But
I'd
I'm
agree
not
with
going
that
to.
too. I will say first, it's fun driving an EV. It's amazing how quickly you can get to 90 miles an hour and not feel it. And it just sort of goes. But it's hydrogen, and maybe it's a publicity issue with it because it's a neat technology. It's effective as they continue to improve, electrolysis and different things like that are driving the production of hydrogen in that space. I mean, all signs are pointing to like, yeah, this is effective. This is something we can do. Efficiency is great, from kind of the bigger energy perspective. But with all of the trouble EVs are having, it's like, how do I charge it? Where do I go? How do I get this? Well, I know where to get electrons. I got a plug sitting next to me. If push really came to
Right.
shove, I know how to go out and get electricity to charge. But where the hell do I get hydrogen? And talk about building infrastructure out and how do those different things work and all the logistics associated with like a mass transition to something in that space. It's just I don't know. I don't know where hydrogen comes from. I don't know where I go get that. I don't know how you build that infrastructure out and what that looks like. So maybe it's an
So
optics thing. Maybe it's a
I've
publicity thing we're having
I've got a
with.
good story about that. So one of my most evergreen episodes I've ever done was on ProTerra buses. Now ProTerra does electric, but they've also done
Mhm.
hydrogen fuel cell buses. They sold a bus to NASA back in like 2011 for about $2 million. That was a hydrogen fuel cell hybrid bus. So it had electric batteries and the
Mhm.
hydrogen, and it was a hybrid bus. And they were using it just on the NASA campus, okay, down in Florida. Well, what's interesting is in the United States, there's about 50 hydrogen gas stations. They're all in California, okay? And so that bus went up for sale, and it was for sale for about $75,000. Okay. And it's probably in pristine shape, hasn't been driven though for 4 years, just sitting at NASA. So when somebody saw my video and contacted me, somebody that I knew was looking at buying the bus, and they were looking for information on it, came across the video, and it's like, oh, I know David. I'm going to call him. So, anyways, they called me and we started talking about this. Goes, they're at Port Canaveral where the cruise ship terminal is.
Mhm.
hydrogen is used for something. So while there's not a technically hydrogen gas station, there's a place you could buy hydrogen to fuel it. And so we went through all this and we're like, where do we find a technician who can go in and check out the vehicle? And he had a real good use. He wanted to use it to shuttle people from the port to the airport in Orlando because there's no
Perfect,
port
perfect. Yep.
terminal, and it's about a 45 to 50-minute drive on the freeway there. And it would have been a real good use for it. It's just who knows what it would cost. What's fascinating is though the ProTerra bus was simply almost the same as a Daimler bus that they've been making and selling in Europe, a hydrogen fuel cell bus, since the late '90s. So it was probably a 15-year-old technology, and I think they probably still sell those, but, I don't think we're gonna bring over, somebody from Germany to look at that bus. But it made for a really interesting story, interesting conversation, and every day it's funny, like, because I made that video last summer. 5,
Mhm.
from 1 to 5 people, maybe more, maybe 10 people, watch that stupid video every day. And it's really interesting. I'm like, who are these people who are still looking at information? They're probably people who are just really sour. Proterra went bankrupt, and it was a public company.
Oh, okay, okay.
Sad story to see, but, it was just, a different experience. Well, we're out of time, so I had a couple of things to cover today, but, we had a good chat and some interesting things to cover. And it's good seeing, people asking questions, more people watching and tuning in live while we're doing the show. Anyways, Mike, I wanna thank you for being on here today, and, folks, please make sure to leave us comments, let us know what you'd like to see in the future, and, please like the video so more people will see it.